good.
Anyway, hi, David. Nice to
Hello.
see you. So this is David C. Mohr, and he's trained as a psychologist. He's a professor of preventive medicine and director of Northwestern University's Center for Behavioral Intervention Technologies, or CBITS. His work lies at the intersection of behavioral science, technology, and clinical research, focusing on the design and implementation of interventions that harness wireless and web-based technologies to promote mental health and wellness. The overarching goal of his work is to sustainably implement digital mental health interventions in real-world care settings. Take it away, David. Welcome.
All right. Well, thank you, Donna. And it's a pleasure to be here. I will go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Are you seeing? Is everybody seeing my screen?
Yep. Looks great.
Okay. Good. So yeah, I was asked to talk about developing and implementing behavioral intervention technologies. So that's what I'm going to try to do. Before I get started, I have to just say I've, my disclosures. So I've accepted consulting and honorary from Otska and OneMind. I have an ownership interest in Adaptive Health, which has licensed some of the things that I'm going to be talking about from Northwestern, and the funding for this work comes from the National Institute of Mental Health. So what I'm going to be talking about today is I'll give just a brief amount of background, and then I'm going to describe one project that's gone on over a number of years as kind of an illustration for where I see right now we have kind of a research to practice gap in digital mental health. And then I'll stop then and see if people have a few questions. And then talk a little bit about the implications of that for research methodology. And then if we have time, I can talk a little bit about some policy perspectives, which is also part of the landscape of difficulty in rolling out the tools that we all develop. So my work is primarily in depression and anxiety. So the main things I want you to know about this population is that there are some symptoms here that can interfere with people's engagement with digital mental health tools. So people with depression obviously often have depressed mood. They're also often anhedonic, which means they, lack of motivation is part of the symptom, it's sort of the symptoms that they experience. They have difficulty concentrating, and anxiety, they have uncontrollable worry, difficulty concentrating, and avoidance is often part of that. And so the embedded right in the symptoms that people have are also barriers to engagement. The other thing I just want to mention before we get started too far is that I see essentially there are kind of three ways that digital mental health tools can get rolled out. So one is fully automated. You can go to an app store, you can download it, you can use it however you want. Then there are coached, or some people say guided interventions. And so those typically have a human being on the other side that offers kind of low intensity support, often around keeping people engaged, and sometimes a little bit of assistance in implementing what's being done. It doesn't spill over into being psychotherapy. And then there are adjunctive tools. So tools that are used in the context of psychotherapy or in the context of pharmacotherapy to keep people adherent to their medications. I'm going to be really focused on that middle one here, the coached interventions. And there's a reason for that. So there are now over 100 randomized controlled trials for digital mental health tools across a lot of different kinds of conditions. And they overwhelmingly show that self-directed or fully automated tools are at best modestly effective. And that's primarily because people don't stay engaged. So most people, I think the data are right now that about 97% of people who download really the best apps on the App Store, the top 30, 97% abandon them within the first 2 weeks. But if you add a coach in, you get really good results in these trials. You get results that look similar to what you get in psychotherapy, in pharmacotherapy, and the coaches are typically not licensed or mental health professionals. They're often BA level people, or paraprofessionals. So these have been shown in randomized controlled trials to be very effective, But what we see is when these get rolled out into real healthcare settings, they don't work all that well. So this is what's called the classic research to practice gap. And so, some of the problems with the research to practice gap are that, we failed to design for patients. I think that's getting better. I think most people are integrating patients more into their design, but we've also aren't really doing a good job of designing for providers and designing for organizations. And I'm going to give you some examples of some embarrassing examples of where we've seen that. So designing for the patient, most of us started out in this business, I'm a clinician. I know what, if patients do certain things, that they're more likely to get better. I design tools to try to get them to do that. And we really didn't think much about how to embed it into the fabric of people's lives. So, when you get prescribed a medication, if your doctor does a good job, they might say, put it next to your, your toothbrush so that you see it and you remember to take it. So they try to integrate it into the person's life. But how do you integrate that into, if you're delivering it through a device, into how they use that device, where how they interact with the device, how it can be used simply. And so we've done a fair amount of user-centered design around this issue. And I know there are other people that are going to be talking about this, so I won't go into depth on what user-centered design is, other than to say that it's a way of interacting and getting information from people, giving a voice in the design of tools, of systems, giving a voice to end users in their design. So what we've learned just in broad strokes is that most of the people we've talked to have tried mental health apps and they abandon them quickly. What we see that people want, they do use apps. They often use apps that weren't designed for mental health. Like if people want to track something, they'll just download a spreadsheet on their phone. A lot of women talked about using mood tracking, the mood tracking part of menstrual tracking apps. They found that useful. So people do use technologies, they just don't use the things that we've designed. The things that they use tend to be easy to use, intuitive, quick, and usually give them something of value back immediately. So, I started to think about, we develop tools for, and I'm not saying I'm going to present this and I'm not going to say this is the right way to do it, but this is just sort of an example of kind of how we started to take this information in. So I started to think, well, we're developing interventions for depression and anxiety, which are really complicated, but people are using tools that are, really simple. And I started to think about this like, transportation is a problem that we all use our phones for, but I don't have a transportation app, right? I've got a mapping app, I've got a taxi app, I've got rideshare apps, I've got a parking app, I've got an app for the Chicago Transit Authority. I've got lots of apps that help me with transportation, and they're all pretty quick and easy to use, and they serve a larger function. So, I started to think, well, in the mental health space, it's kind of similar. We have all of these things that we know that if people do it, they'll get, they're likely to get better. Behavioral activation. If we get people out, doing more positive stuff, they're going to feel better. Cognitive restructuring. If people can learn to identify negative attributions and challenge them, they're going to get better. There's goal setting, problem solving, affect regulation. There's all these things that we know if people will do it, it's likely to help. And then there's all kinds of ways that people interact with a phone. So some people like reading on their phone. Some people don't. Some people like, watching videos or listening to audio. Some people, like getting messages. Well, most people message on their phone. Some people like logging and tracking things. Some people don't. So there's a lot of different interactions that people can have that might lead to using it more or not. And so rather than think about an app for depression, what we did was develop a suite of 13 different apps, that each of which represented a different psychological strategy, each of which had, we tried to represent different ways of interacting. And then there was a hub app that kind of organized people's experience. And so the goal wasn't to get them to use an app, but it was just to get them to find something that was going to be useful to them. Also, most of these apps were pretty quick and easy to use. So for example, This is daily feats. So this was essentially a checklist. So people rated, you downloaded it, you rated your level of depression. And if you were really depressed, it gave you 4 things to do, get out of bed in the morning, eat something, groom yourself, and leave the house. And if you do 2 of those things for 4 or 5 days, you get a streak, and then you level up and you get another 4 things to do. So this takes a couple of seconds a day. And this was pretty sticky. Another one was that was fairly sticky was day to day. So this just gave people a brief bit of content at the beginning of each week, and then around 4 or 5 messages a day that just kept that content in people's minds, sort of to engage in those things. That was it. So it's pretty passive. Mostly it's just people are receiving things. So these, and then there were things that were a little more traditional, like Thought Challenger was kind of a thought, cognitive restructuring tool. This was kind of playing with images, so people could take an image and attach an aphorism to it, and it would launch periodically. So we tried to create things that were really generally pretty simple and easy to use. We've done a number of trials. I'm going to talk about the last one where we embedded it in primary care, but all the trials used kind of a similar coaching, sort of low intensity coaching strategy. So they were all done over 8 weeks. There's a 30-minute or so engagement call where they talk with the coach. They create a bond, a relationship. They make sure that the participant or patient understands kind of what each other's roles are. And then the coach sends 3 text messages a week, mostly positive reinforcement if they're using it, or offering to help if they're not. That's pretty much it. So this trial was the first one where we embedded it in a healthcare system, and this was done at the University of Arkansas in their primary care clinic. And the thing that I want to point out here is the income. So 20% of these people were below the poverty level. Another 40% were between 1 and 2 times the poverty level. So this was not a well-heeled group of people. This was reasonably representative of Little Rock, Arkansas. So the trial, people were randomized at the beginning. They were randomized to receive either treatment as usual, so continuing to receive treatment from their primary care physician, which was usually an antidepressant medication, or treatment as usual plus IntelliCare. And so you can see the purple line there is treatment as usual. They got a little bit better. When we added IntelliCare in, there was a substantial improvement in symptoms. And then at 8 weeks, at the end of the treatment, we crossed them over, and the people who were receiving treatment as usual got IntelliCare, and then they got a nice drop in symptoms. So, this is the kind of effectiveness data that we want to see in a trial. And one of the reasons that I think we saw this was we got good engagement. So usually when you see an engagement graph for digital mental health or digital tools, it looks kind of like a hockey stick. People start out strong, it drops off, and then there's kind of a low level of engagement. We saw really a somewhat flatter line. So, people use the apps an average of 146 times over the course of the 8 weeks, or 2.5 times a day. So this idea of kind of simple engagement seemed to work. Around 90% of the people finished the treatment. So this was, this is what we wanted to see, right? So far, so good. So let's talk a little bit about now integration into the healthcare system. So we did a really careful job of looking at how we integrated. And I'm not going to go into this little map, but these were the maps that we drew of how to have alerts launch in the EHR, how then the physicians could, refer people, all of that good stuff. So we had kind of a careful, implementation plan. And then we also had direct to patient. So through flyers in the clinic, identifying patients in the medical record who met criteria for depression and sending them a notification. So how did that work? I mean, obviously we recruited the trial, but over the course of the trial, there were, in these clinics, there were 1,135 patients who were potentially eligible. And so we enrolled 13% of them. So you can see here in the first line the first line here, this is the percent of the treatments that are the percent of the trial that was enrolled by these methods. So the direct to patient, we had 73% through the registry or the PHQ-9 and 4% through clinic flyers. Through EHR alerts and the physicians, we only got 4%. But then if you look at the yield from those, of the people that we sent this direct, we only got 4% there. But if a physician recommended it, we got 50%. So having the clinicians engaged is really important. So because we had a large population, we could enroll our trial, but we weren't really reaching people. You know, if you're going to really implement this, you need the clinicians involved. And even though we went through this painstaking process of working out a plan, we've learned that it's more difficult to get, you know, physicians to change their behavior than it is to get patients to change their behavior. So this is really a critical piece. So just to you know, provide you with some more embarrassing examples. This was an implementation trial that we started at Rush Medical Center here in Chicago. So Rush has around 250,000 primary care patients. Their primary care does a really good job of screening. So they screen about 90% of their patients. Patients who screen positive are referred to collaborative care, where care managers then oversee and do provide kind of low intensity support for patients. And importantly here, this was done as a quality project. So we did not have to consent people. And that to me is really, really critical, because our consent processes, you know, they have to do a screening and then go through a consent process. And so what you're doing really is selecting people who are more likely to be engaged. You're not getting the average patient who is depressed and unmotivated or anxious and avoidant. You know, you're getting people who are willing to who can get through that consenting process. So this, there were good things and there were bad things here. So, you know, with the care managers, we started off when they would introduce it, the uptake was initially around 15%. We were able to get it up to about 60% by, you know, adjusting when they were introducing it, how they were talking about it. So that made it a surprisingly, how care managers talked about it made a surprisingly large difference in how they, you know, in uptake. But they still could not follow up. So, you know, remember I said that the patients were, you know, the care managers were supposed to at least send out, you know, 2 or 3 messages a week. And that was really difficult for the care managers to integrate into their workflow, even though it only takes a few moments. The EHR, we were able to fully integrate it into the EHR, so data flowed in. We created the dashboards within the EHR for the care managers to do their monitoring. But because of that, a lot of the information was deprecated that they needed, so they didn't always have the information that they needed. We had a lot of software problems that I won't go into, which, you know, happens. The patients, you know, we had problems with patient engagement. And then the organization, we were able, you know, on the plus side, we were able to start working with the organization to find billing codes, because that's, you know, important for engagement. But you know, along the way, the organization, the care management program changed its objectives. So they started out wanting to provide patients with some behavioral support, and they shifted to only wanting to provide support for medications, to keep people adherent to medications. So what we were doing became kind of irrelevant and a problem for them, because it didn't really match their goals. So this is kind of an example, another example of an implementation that, you know, in spite of some careful work, you know, fell apart with the care managers because it didn't fit into their objectives. It fell apart with integrating into the EHR because we couldn't represent information to the providers that they needed to have. So there were a lot of difficulties. So the summary here and take home is we have a research to practice gap. You know, we think that, you know, user-centered design with end users or patients, it works. But, you know, we really need to start expanding how we think about that and think about the delivery context, think about, you know, who is involved, all of the stakeholders. I mean, it's not just the patient, but there's a lot of stakeholders involved in these tools, and we need to be designing for them. So I'm going to pause here before I get into the implications for this for research design and see if I'll take a few questions before I move on. if you have any.
Maybe it's a good idea to finish it up and then,
Okay, I can do that.
yeah.
So for, for evaluation, the gold standard is the randomized controlled trial. And there are people who've argued that we shouldn't have randomized controlled trials for digital mental health or digital tools. I am one that feels that we should, because I think it's important to protect patients and providers and payers, stakeholders, to ensure that what we're giving people actually does have benefit. But the methods that we have for clinical trials are derived primarily from pharmaceutical trials. And so what does that mean? That means that a pharmaceutical trial, they develop, an agent, a pharmacological agent is developed, and then that is tested throughout the trial. And then if it's effective and it gets approved, it has a horizon of decades and tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of patients using it. And that molecule is the same. That is not the case in digital technologies. The nature of digital technologies is to change. So that's one place in which I think our research methods what we're doing doesn't fit standard randomized controlled trial methodology. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. So what are some other contributors? Well, one is time. So a lot of this is a fairly now famous kind of widely used concept, but it takes 17 years to turn 14% of original research into the benefit of patients. And you have basic science, you have clinical trials, approval, and a lot of these clinical trials, this methodology has kind of stages. So you do a phase 2 trial, then you do a phase 3 trial, and all of this takes an enormous amount of time. And this is no different for digital, at least in digital mental health. So here we are in 2022, and so 17 years ago was what, about 2005? There were no iPhones, there were no Android phones. The world looks pretty different, and yet the first implementation trial that I'm aware of for digital mental health was Simon Gilbody's trial, where they rolled it out in 47 primary care clinics in the UK. And what did he use? He used 2 programs that were developed in 2002 and 2003. So, we're not really, we are, our methodologies still have this long timeline. So we need to be more rapid. Yep. I think we're hearing a dog from somebody, so if you can mute. Then another problem is what I call the denominator problem. So, what percentage of people are we actually getting? And this, I think, is really important because engagement is such a huge problem in our field. So what's the ratio of people who are enrolled versus recruitment? And so we looked at our own, the work that was going on a few years ago in our center, and we, across, for 700 people recruited across a couple of trials, we had 27,000 web screens, and I have no idea how many people actually saw our advertisements. So just of the web screens, we're only getting 2.5% of the people who completed those. And when we looked at the recruitment direct from clinics, it was, around 1% or less that we were getting of the patients who were eligible. And this is not just us. So usually this is not reported. You usually don't see this reported, but there's this paper, and this was a good paper. I'm not criticizing them, but they actually reported it. So they advertised to all 8.7 million members of this German insurance company, and it took them 1 year to recruit 406 people for this digital mental health intervention. So that's it's an infinitesimally small group of people. And so if you're filtering like that, who are you getting? You're getting people who are really interested in using what you want to use. And that's a problem when you try. So the standard idea for moving from trials to implementation is that you do your clinical research and then you build an implementation bridge and then you put it in the real setting. But I'm questioning whether we can really do that, whether we can actually build an implementation bridge for the kind, given the kinds of methods that we have. So we've come up with this, what we call accelerated creation to sustainment model, or ACT. What we're really trying to do here is make it rapid, trying to reduce that time from the idea to getting something that's out there that's sustainable, and to integrate iteration and adaptation in the context of the entire treatment line. Not saying that we hold something constant, but allowing during trials to learn from it and adapt. And so, these phases, what we talk about is initially a create or an adapt phase, and not just designing for the patient, but designing for all of the stakeholders who are involved, and designing it in the context where it's going to be delivered, and not just designing the technology, but designing the service protocol. What are care managers going to do? What is the implementation plan? And then move to a hybrid trial. So there are methods, hybrid trials now, that integrate effectiveness and implementation. And so we are also saying we need to integrate optimization. We can't keep these things constant. If we keep it constant, you're going to make a bunch of changes at the other end because you're going to know everything that's wrong with a thing. And so why not integrate that into the process of the clinical trial? And then ultimately our goal is to end up with something that's sustainable in that care setting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the optimization piece, because that's where I think I get the most pushback with this idea. And so these are my thoughts. Not everybody agrees with them. But optimization is essentially a process of detecting problems. So you have a system to detect problems that might be looking at usage data. Maybe parts of what you're doing is not working. Getting user feedback from stakeholders about the process, coming up with solutions for that, developing those solutions, deploying them, and monitoring whether they fix the problem, and just continuing to do that in an iterative cycle over the course of a trial. So the big problem with this is maintaining internal validity, and so I'll try to explain what internal validity is for those of you who are not clinical trial people. But internal validity is essentially, if you run a trial, internal validity is the question, can I really believe these results? How confident am I that in my interpretations? And so, for example, control groups are used in clinical trials because, if you treat somebody for treat somebody for depression and you see that they improve, it might be because it's what you did. But it's also, we know that people generally enter studies when they're at their worst, and they're going to get better over the course of a study anyway. So you have a control group to be able to parse that out. And so, one of the problems with allowing iteration is, how do we know what it is that we're testing? And so my argument is that in these kinds of trials, we're not testing a technology. You're not testing whether somebody can click a button or what they can do or whether it works. We're really testing a set of principles, because as things iterate, the basic code that you have in a tool is going to change. Some of the ways in which care managers interact with it are going to change. So really what we're testing is principles. So what we have to do is define what those principles are. And so this, what we proposed as a first step is, you have to have the aims of the intervention. You have to define what the service is. You have to define what the technologies are. You have to define the implementation. And so that might look something like, the aim of this trial is to evaluate a technology-enabled service that, and then the service might be, supports care managers in helping patients with goal setting, symptom management, and treatment monitoring, and supports patients with behavioral activation and problem solving. So there you have kind of what you're trying to do. The technology is a mobile app that's used by an individual patient, and it's connected to a care management dashboard. And the implementation is through a care management division in a medical center, and the aim is to improve depression and anxiety. And so, if you find that some part of your behavioral activation tool just isn't working, people don't understand it, it's not working well, iterate on it. But if what you're hearing is that people want, they want to be able to get some social support from their friends and their family, then that's starting to integrate a social feature that really is not part of the principles that you're testing. And so that, that's kind of off the table. So by defining the principles up front, it gives you kind of the constraints to know what you can change and what you can't change, so that at the end you have a trial that is interpretable. I think, we should be tracking that and reporting it and not being ashamed of it. And there actually are now consort eHealth guidelines that for reporting in papers that there's a section on there on reporting changes in the technology that occurred during the trial. So it's not something you need to, I think we need to hide. And then there are methods, I won't go into detail here, there are methods for analysis that can be used. And you can use just standard methods of analyzing trial design, but there are also there are methods that you can use to identify whether those changes actually made a difference or not. So that's here the take homes here are that what we're trying to do with these methods are to make them more rapid, to move people out, to make them more rapid so we don't have this long delay, to represent real world, the needs of stakeholders in the real world, and to recognize that change and iteration is part of the nature of technologies, and to recognize that that feature of digital tools and integrate it into the methods that we use. So that's the bit that I have on research methods. And then, I think we don't pay very much attention to the larger, policy issues, but all of this exists in a larger societal framework that is also evolving. So a couple of years ago, the Banbury Center is a center that's part of Cold Springs Harbor, which is a national laboratory in Cold Springs, New York. And so they have this conference center, which part of their mission is to identify where there are these research to practice gaps and try to facilitate change. And so they contacted Pat Arian and myself and said, this seems to be a problem. Would you like, can we help in some way? And so they helped us put together a meeting of about 25 stakeholders representing payers, so Optum, Magellan, care systems, healthcare systems, policy, self-insured employers, companies, a few researchers, patient representatives. So, a lot of stakeholders to spend a couple of 2.5 days talking about, where are the barriers here in for rolling out digital mental health in the United States. And we also had international representatives from countries that are already doing this, like the UK and Australia. And so this document, which was published last year, came out with three recommendations. So the first finding was that there is enough evidence out there that to show that coached digital mental health treatments are effective for depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, and so those should be available to all Americans who are experiencing those problems. The two big barriers they saw where there was consensus was that there's no reimbursement mechanisms and there's no way for decision makers to determine what are effective products. And so the other recommendations were that they should be reimbursable and that there should be some sort of evidence framework for this. And so we've some kind of evidence framework document. And so, we're continuing to work on this, and there has been some movement on this in these areas since this. So I'll just talk briefly about this. So the components of an evidence framework, and these are derived from both the UK, the National Institute of Clinical Effectiveness, which is the UK's governmental entity which reviews and approves treatments for the English healthcare system, and the American Psychiatric Association, which has also done some work. John Toros there, some work in evidence frameworks. And so obviously there needs to be evidence that it's beneficial and that it's effective. But unlike medications, we also need to know that people are going to use it. Medications, there is an adherence problem, but it's a much more significant problem with digital mental health tools. There needs to be, evidence and standards around data sharing and interoperability with healthcare systems, risk management for patients who are these are patients that carry a fair amount of risk with them into treatment. And so there needs to be, evidence and a framework around risk management, data security and privacy, and then equity. Some of this is our legal requirements, like the American with Disabilities Act. There are interpretations for healthcare for what tools have to be able to do, but there was also really consensus among the group that digital mental health should not increase social disparities, because people don't have phones or they live in areas with low connectivity. Those need to be issues that are considered in an evidence framework. So, on reimbursement front, there's been some movement. So the problem with reimbursement in the United States is primarily in fee for service, because there's no mechanism for billing. What we see is for healthcare organizations or patients who are on risk-based contracts, so essentially where the insurance company, rather than paying for each individual service, they pay a healthcare organization X amount of dollars for each patient to care for that patient, and those can be spent those dollars can be spent in whatever way the healthcare organization feels is most effective. And then there are quality indicators that if the healthcare organization meets it, then they get bonuses. So like in depression, the quality indicators include, screening patients, a certain percentage of patients, that's a quality indicator. A certain number of percentage of patients who screen positive, if they get treatment, that's another quality indicator. For the patients who are treated, if they drop a certain amount in their symptom severity, that's a quality indicator. So those kinds of things then can boost the payments. So when there's those kinds of systems in place, we are beginning to see digital mental health rolled out. Kaiser's started to do it. There are Medicaid, some of the Medicaid, some of the states have started risk-based contracting for Medicaid. Massachusetts, Oklahoma, Michigan, and Massachusetts, anyway, I know has started to integrate digital health into that. There are the first codes appearing. So Paratherapeutics got the first HCPCS code, which is kind of a preliminary billing code for testing. Durable medical device codes might be usable. And there's now legislation before the Senate for the Access to Prescription Digital Therapeutics Act of 2022, which which basically directs Medicare and Medicaid to integrate digital therapeutics into their prescription digital therapeutics into their system. The issue with that I have a little bit of a problem with is that the definition of a digital therapeutic is having FDA certification, and I'll talk in a moment about why I think that's a bad idea. But and then for the service, being able to pay for coaches, there are preliminary codes now. These are called CPT codes that provide online digital evaluation and management services. Their E&M codes, unfortunately, are only for doctors and nurses, so you can't have lower levels of licensure or unlicensed people doing that, but that's a first code, and so it's much easier to adapt codes than it is to make new ones. So things are beginning to move in the direction of digital therapeutics, but as with anything, there is money involved, and so there are a lot of payers now, people with or interests with deep pockets involved in this process. And so, one of the challenge, sort of political challenges I see right now is that there's sort of two ways we can think about digital therapeutics being reimbursed. I mean, one is this idea that the FDA will approve, and the the reason that I'm not wild about that is first of all, the FDA only provides basic evidence of efficacy. So, you have to do a randomized controlled trial, but it tells you nothing about how that's going to work in the real world. There's no, adherence in the real world. All of the questions that decision makers have above and beyond efficacy aren't answered by the FDA. That's not in their purview. It's not what they do. And then the other problem is that the FDA is expensive. It takes a long time. And so, my fear is that this is going to lead to a consolidation of companies, which is why I think we're seeing this in the legislation, is that some of the large companies have been able to kind of get this in front of the Senate. The other direction is over the counter, sort of, people can, and that is also, obviously we want, some kind of evidence framework. Unfortunately, in the United States, there is no governmental entity that can provide the same kind of oversight that you see in most countries that have national healthcare systems. We just do not have a governmental entity that can do that. And so one of the things that this Banbury group felt was that really over the counter made more sense for the United States, and to provide a framework for decision making that payers and self-insured employers and other people who are making decisions can use in evaluating products. So that's just to close here, I do think we are in the middle of a revolution here. To put this into historical context, I was originally, as an undergraduate, a history major, so I like that. So in the 1890s, the first I think of as sort of the first revolution in mental health, with the development of psychoanalysis and leading into psychotherapy. I mean, this changed how we thought about mental health. Before that, people were put into asylums. They had, tried to beat the demons out of them. This, for the first time, it kind of changed how we think about the human psyche, and that talking can actually provide benefit to people with mental health problems. And then in the 1950s, there was the development of psychopharmacology and the recognition that there was a whole biological substrate to mental health problems, and gave us a whole new set of tools that could be used. Didn't mean that psychotherapy was not working, but it was a new set of tools that could be used. And I do think, we are in the middle of a revolution in healthcare and in mental health care. It doesn't mean that psychotherapy or psychopharmacology are irrelevant, but it's a new set of tools that can reach broad populations. So it's an exciting time to be involved in what we're doing. And so I'll close here just to say, first of all, thank you for listening. There's a lot of people that are involved in this research, but I wanted to also just mention the Society for Digital Mental Health, which is newly formed. That was an outgrowth of this Banbury group. So that is a professional society, but we're trying to support the rollout of digital mental health in the United States. So membership is free. You can go to that site, and we have the inaugural meeting on the 13th and 14th of June, which you're welcome to attend. It's 2 days, I think 3 hours a day, so not horrible. And then also want to invite you to join our CBITS monthly digital mental health webinar, where we bring people in nationally and internationally to talk on issues related to design, evaluation, policy. So the next one is it's the first Tuesday of every month. We'll be having one in June, and then pausing for July and August, and starting up again in September. So that's it. And if you have any questions, this would be a good time. I'll stop sharing.
Hi, I have a question. My name's Jeannie. I'm from UCSF.
Hi.
So my background is not in mental health. It's in like orthopedics and chronic pain, but I've done like a lot of consulting in the past with digital health companies, helping them design and publish RCTs. And I actually just got back from a conference in my field where I just saw like a study basically that was tracking patients using an Apple Watch, and they called it an RCT, but they just compared it to patients that didn't otherwise have an Apple Watch. And I just think this idea of a control arm for digital care is so important and so poorly executed sometimes. And I'm really curious what you think, like, or what you think is a good control arm for some of these digital interventions to really decipher the effect.
That is a great question, and it's really I mean, I think like when we write grants, we end up spending more time thinking about the control group than the intervention, because it's really difficult. I think first of all, what you said, the first thing that you alerted me to was that it was not randomized, and that's a huge problem, because really randomization is what makes that control group a true control group. You know, otherwise people are essentially self-selecting, and so, you know, who goes out and buys an Apple Watch? I mean, it's usually people that want to track stuff. And if you don't have an Apple Watch, you're less likely to be somebody who really wants to track stuff. So, you know, so people who are using the Apple Watch, they may be tracking stuff in lots of other ways.
I think they were giving the Apple Watches to certain patients. But wouldn't the controls know they're controls, because when they see the consent form, they know they're not part of a intervention study?
Yeah, so you know, then there's the issue of, you know, what is in the control, and that's another I think another kind of difficult question. I have, and I can send you a paper. I basically think that it depends on what the question is. Like if you're very early on, you know, you don't want to kill innovation by having a control group that is you know, going to take out all the variation, all the variants. You know, so it may be a treatment as usual, or a kind of treatment, but we also know that giving people something can, you know, may be good. There was a paper that came out just recently in JMIR. This is in schizophrenia, and they gave people an app, and then the control treatment was an app with a watch on it. That was it, and there was no difference between them. So, you know, and I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't given them something, but you know, sometimes. So I do think that having some other kind of treatment, if you're interested in you know, understanding whether the mechanism of, you know, if you're interested in testing the mechanisms that you believe are effective, then you probably need some sort of sham treatment to verify that it's not just getting something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take up all your time, but I think that I think what you just said sounds really interesting, because the control group had more things, which I think we tend to pare down the control group. So that's a great idea. But with digital health, obviously patient engagement is a big factor. So I think for all these studies, teasing apart just pure patient engagement from what you're actually giving them as the therapy is what we really need to understand, like, is having an effect or not.
Yeah, and I think so. I also think that, you know, when we say engagement, you know, there's really no good definition of engagement. You know, I think we in the clinical science side, we tend to define it as app usage, but that's really a pretty poor definition of engagement, because you can imagine that, you know, somebody who is using an app and just, you know, they get a ping and they go in and do it, and then they go off and do something else. You know, they're not really cognitively engaged. They're not engaged with the app, you know, fully, as opposed to somebody who is, you know, really thinking about it and engaged on multiple levels, not just with their behavior on the app. So, you know, I think there's a woman, Saskia Kelders, who's in Holland, who does really nice work on that. She's got a measure of engagement that's broader than just app usage. And then, you know, we've also seen you know, people stop using things when they get better. So, you know, you can get kind of a false, you know, that sort of diminishes it. So like we've seen, like with depression, when we've done these analyses where we take people's level of depression and predict the usage for the next week, and then the week, you know, their usage, and predict their level of depression. And we see that, you know, higher depression predicts more usage in the next week. And more usage predicts lower depression. So it's a complicated, it's a complicated relationship. So just, you know, looking at, you know, is the number of app launches related to the improvement is we generally don't see very much of an association, and really, you know, when you start to think about it, you probably, there's lots of reasons why you wouldn't see a lot of correlation.
Thank you.
I see your hand up, but I'm going to read two questions that came before you out of the chat.
Yeah.
One of them is, have you examined how treatment seeking interacts with user engagement? So,
That's an interesting question.
do users who have sought out clinicians for help respond equally to your digital health, mental health thing as users who are treatment seeking but not via clinical services, like self-help?
We haven't really looked at that. You know, I would, you know, and I think sort of the implication of the question is that, you know, the suspicion that people who seek out treatment are going to be more engaged and get more benefit. And I suspect that that's, you know, that's the case. I mean, I think that's the reason that I worry about this. You know, it's what I call a denomination problem, that the denominator effect, that, you know, we're essentially, you know, through our trial methodology and through our consent processes, we are, you know, essentially enrolling people who are more motivated than the average person.
But I mean, is that a bad thing? I mean, yes, people.
It's not a bad thing, you know, for your trial, but it's not giving you a good representation of what it's going to look like in the real world.
Maybe it is. I mean, you know, that I think all medicine works that way. You got to want to.
So that was my question, and it's exactly what you said, especially with the last point that you brought in, saying that you know, having this over the counter, you know, has a particular path in the US, et cetera. And so if it is that, if we have a different user, then, you know, how do we predict if treatment's going to work or not for them?
I think, but I want to go back. So I think it is important to know, because, you know, because if you think about a healthcare system that is, you know, going to make an investment in putting together the infrastructure to deploy one of these tools, whether, you know, of course, you're not going to get 100%, but it would be good to know, is it 50%? Is it 10%? Is it 1%? Because if it's 1%, it may not be worth, you know, investing that much in. So I think this, you know, that is something that decision makers need to know, and that's not something that is provided through sort of standard trial methodology. And it's not that that produces useless information. It produces information about what the potential effect is, but it doesn't tell you anything about kind of what at the population level you're gonna see.
Sure. Dave, we
yeah,
have
sorry, I didn't, what?
3 questions here going on. There's Jessie, who's got her hand up, and then 2 in the chat. So let's go to Jessie.
Hey, David, thanks for the talk. I just have a question related to your comment that sort of that engagement is a bigger problem with digital mental health interventions compared to like pharmacotherapy. Do you think that's true? Do you think, I mean, it seems like engagement is a real big problem in pharmacotherapy. I guess some of the ways sometimes in the past I've thought about it is that with pharmacotherapy, the FDA is just approving that it's not going to make you have like 3 eyes or something. It's not really approving anything else. But with digital interventions, it's almost like the standard is higher. And some of the meetings I've sat in on with the FDA talking about approvals, like it seems like it's held to such a higher standard. I agree with your point that it seems like an extra, it seems like a really important piece of the puzzle if you're thinking about actually using it in the real world. And so it's hard to separate that. Maybe it is for medications too, and that's just been off the table though. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, I think you're making a good point. So you know, for medications, I think you know, I've seen some statistics that, you know, 90% of people prescribed an antidepressant by their primary care physician stop taking it in the first few months. You know, the modal number of sessions for psychotherapy is 1. You know, most people go and don't go back. So I, you know, I think you're raising a valid point, but you know, I also heard from, you know, these stakeholders that this was information that they wanted to have in making a decision. So they want to understand, is this usable? If we make an investment in this, are people actually going to use it, or are we going to be putting something in place that that isn't usable? And that doesn't mean that doesn't necessarily mean that all of this has to be done in research, but there needs to be guidelines around this. So, for example, Optum has they've been involved in this for quite a while, so they actually have a pretty it seems like a fairly fleshed out process when they evaluate the product. So they don't, they want to see that there's some effectiveness data, but then they put it through a whole process of, getting members, patients, members who are insured by Optum to look at it. That goes through, internal reviews by heuristic reviews. They give it to patients to see how they use it. They give it to providers to see how they use it. So it's a piece that gets evaluated, and there's, they have a structure in there, essentially a set of guidelines for themselves that they go through. And so, but they've been doing this for a long time, and they have a lot of expertise. So what does that mean for, a healthcare center that hasn't been doing this? How do they get that information? How do they know? And so I think that's where I think having sort of evidence standards guidelines that determine kind of what should the company provide? What are the things that what are the things that a decision maker should be thinking about in making a decision? I think we're hearing that people want that information, and so how that's represented in a evidence framework, I think, is something that we're going to have to work out, and that's something that part of what we're going to be trying to put together through the society is some work groups with stakeholders who can come up with this evidence framework.
David, you've got 3 minutes and a bunch of questions, 3 questions.
Okay.
So I'm going to read them. So the first one is, do you have any thoughts on how to accurately measure engagement? Maybe you want to punt that to.
Well,
I think.
Well, that was my question. I think you already answered it. It's a lot more complex than just usage. It's affect, it's interest, it's the cognitive aspect as well.
And the emotional and the affective, yes.
Yeah, all of that. And that's why I think it's difficult, more so than pharmaceuticals, is that's a space of kind of like we're not measuring all of that, and we're not able to incorporate how they're internalizing everything the intervention is teaching. And then because we can't understand engagement fully, it's hard to compare interventions to other interventions to, see which is more effective, because we have no dose. And I don't know, it's just such a huge problem. And I know that you're, I just published a paper on this and referenced you in a lot of it. So I know you're intimately aware of it, but I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how can we measure this?
So I think part of the problem with measurement is that there's no clear definition of what it is. So I will, and I don't know if there's a way I can just send some references to the group. So there's a nice paper by Gavin Doherty that is an overview of how in HCI people have thought about engagement, and it's a long, complex paper, and it really drives home what a mess it is in the HCI literature. And then, like I mentioned, Saskia Kelders is the person that I think has done the most around how to measure it, and she's come up with kind of
If you send those references to me, I'll make sure that people get them.
I'll do that. Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna just really quick. We've got 1 minute. Do you think COVID-19 has impacted engagement with mHealth interventions?
Absolutely.
We're finding that. Okay. Talk.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that there's a lot more, companies that provide it have seen a huge jump in people going and subscribing to their services. Healthcare organizations, have started to embrace this and look for it. So COVID has been a game changer for I think digital therapeutics generally.
This person said that they find that participants enjoy the paper intervention manual more now because they've got time at home with it.
Yeah, that's possible too. Yeah.
Okay, 1 more minute, one more question. Have you ever used smart designs or others to see which components gives the most bang for your buck?
Sort of. I mean, we haven't used smart designs, you
most?
know, or most. I worry a little bit about most. I'm not a huge proponent of it because I think that there's a lot of it is in the interactions between the tools. And when you look at kind of, I mean, it's not, I think it has its place, but there's a lot that happens in the interaction between, you know, between modules or pieces that, you know, gets lost in a most design. We've done that a little bit with, you know, that IntelliCare, and we did see that, you know, that different people use different things. So we did a factor analysis, and, you know, it kind of fell out the way you'd expect. So there were sort of people that liked things that were sort of cognitively engaging. They tended to like other things that were cognitively engaging. People that liked, you know, the insomnia thing tend to also like the relaxation app. People that like checklists tended to like checklists, you know, so it did fall out into these constructs. So I think, you know, I'm not sure that it's what works best, but it's figuring out what works for whom and how to personalize it.
Absolutely. Okay, David, it is 2:01, so I'm going to stop. Thank you so much for a great talk. You'll send me those references. That would be very useful, and I will make sure that the participants
Sure.
get them. Okay,
Thank
fantastic.
you all.
Everyone, it's been a great day, and may you all, may the force be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.